She was broke and pregnant. Now, she owns 5 daycares. The eviction notice trembled in Amara's hands as she stood in the doorway of her cramped apartment, her 6-month pregnant belly pressing against the thin fabric of her only maternity dress that wasn't torn. 3 days. That's all the landlord had given her. 3 days to pack up what little she owned and find somewhere else to go with no money, no family, and a baby growing inside her that kicked harder with each passing hour, as if sensing its mother's desperation. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the broken blinds, painting stripes across the peeling yellow walls that had witnessed too many tears, too many prayers whispered into the darkness when hope felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. Her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, watched from across the hall with pitying eyes, holding her toddler Marcus on her hip while the child played with a wooden spoon, blissfully unaware of the crushing weight of adult problems that pressed down on the adults around him. "Please, Mr. Harrison, just 1 more week," Amara had begged the landlord that morning, her pride dissolving like sugar in rain as she stood in his office that smelled of cigars and old leather. But Harold Harrison was a man who measured life in numbers on spreadsheets, not in the desperation etched into a young woman's face or the way her hands unconsciously protected her unborn child. He'd seen too many sob stories, heard too many promises that never materialized into rent payments. 3 days, Miss Johnson. That's already more than I'm required to give." His words had fallen like hammers, each one driving another nail into the coffin of her hopes. Now, standing in her apartment that had been home for 2 years, Amara felt the walls closing in, not physically but emotionally, spiritually, as if the universe itself was shrinking around her, leaving no space for her to exist. The refrigerator hummed its broken tune, sometimes working, sometimes not, much like everything else in her life. She had exactly $17.32 to her name, counted and recounted a dozen times as if the number might magically change. The father of her baby had disappeared 4 months ago when she'd told him about the pregnancy, leaving only a text message that said, "I can't do this," and a void where partnership should have been. Her parents had passed away in a car accident 3 years ago, leaving her truly alone in a city that seemed to swallow people whole without ever noticing they were gone. That evening, as Amara sat on her threadbare couch trying to make a list of shelters that might take her in, she heard a commotion in the hallway. Mrs. Chen was arguing on the phone in rapid Mandarin, her voice rising with each word while little Marcus tugged at her leg, crying for attention. Through the thin walls that let every sound pass through like tissue paper, Amara understood the crisis without understanding the language. Mrs. Chen's babysitter had quit without warning, and she had a night shift at the hospital that started in 2 hours. The hospital where she worked as a nurse didn't care about childcare emergencies. They only cared that she showed up to tend to the sick and dying. Amara watched through her peephole as Mrs. Chen hung up the phone and slumped against the wall, Marcus now wailing louder, picking up on his mother's distress the way children always seem to do. Without thinking, driven by something deeper than logic, Amara opened her door. "I'll watch him," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Mrs. Chen looked up, mascara smudged under her eyes from tears she'd been trying not to cry. "I can't pay much," Mrs. Chen whispered, shame coloring her cheeks. "I don't need money," Amara replied, surprising herself with the truth of it. "But if you have any food you could spare, I haven't eaten today." It wasn't begging, not exactly. It was survival meeting opportunity in the narrow hallway of a building where dreams went to die. Mrs. Chen returned 20 minutes later with Marcus, a diaper bag and 2 bags of groceries that felt like treasure in Amara's arms. Rice, vegetables, some chicken, milk, bread, and even a small container of prenatal vitamins that Mrs. Chen had bought with her employee discount. "For the baby," she said simply, her hand briefly touching Amara's belly in a gesture of understanding between 2 women who knew what it meant to struggle. Marcus toddled into Amara's apartment without fear, immediately fascinated by the patterns the broken fan made as it stuttered through its rotations. For the next 8 hours, while Mrs. Chen saved lives at the hospital, Amara discovered something she hadn't expected. Watching Marcus wasn't just about survival or getting a meal. as she played with him using pots and pans as drums, as she told him stories about brave little boys who conquered dragons made of shadows, as she held him when he grew tired and sang lullabies her own mother had once sung to her. Something inside her that had been frozen began to thaw. The apartment didn't feel quite as small with the child's laughter filling it. The peeling paint became a canvas for imagination when Marcus pointed at the shapes and Amara invented stories about cloud kingdoms and butterfly princes. When Mrs. Chen returned at 3 in the morning, exhausted but grateful, she found Marcus asleep on Amara's couch, covered with Amara's only good blanket, while Amara sat watching him, her hand on her belly, feeling her own baby respond to the peace that had somehow entered the chaos of her life. "You're good with him," Mrs. Chen said softly, picking up her sleeping son with the practiced ease of a mother who'd done this 1,000 times. "He doesn't usually settle for strangers." She paused at the door, Marcus's head on her shoulder, and looked back at Amara. "My friend Rosa, she works at the factory. She needs someone for her twins tomorrow. Day shift. Would you?" The question hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning. Amara nodded, trying not to seem too eager, too desperate, even though desperation was all she had left. Mrs. Chen smiled, the kind of smile that said she understood more than words could express. "I'll tell her. 8 in the morning. She'll pay $40 for the day." $40. It might as well have been 40,000 for what it meant to Amara in that moment. As Mrs. Chen left, Amara stood in her empty apartment that suddenly didn't feel quite as empty. She had 2 days left before eviction, but for the first time in months, she had something more than fear. She had a plan forming in her mind, delicate as spider silk but growing stronger with each passing moment. The next morning, Rosa arrived with her twins, Isabella and Diego, both 3 years old with matching dimples and mischievous grins that reminded Amara of sunshine breaking through storm clouds. Rosa was a small woman with calloused hands and tired eyes, but she hugged Amara like they were old friends when Mrs. Chen introduced them in the hallway. "You're saving my life," Rosa said in accented English, pressing $50 into Amara's hand instead of 40. "Mrs. Chen says you're trustworthy. That's worth everything to a mother." The twins immediately took to Amara's apartment, fascinated by the way the morning light made rainbows through the cracked window and how their voices echoed in the nearly empty rooms. Amara turned the day into an adventure, using cardboard boxes from the dumpster to create castles, teaching them songs, making lunch from the groceries Mrs. Chen had brought, stretching everything to feed 3 mouths instead of 1. She told them stories while they napped on cushions she'd arranged on the floor, her own exhaustion forgotten in the face of their trust. When Rosa returned that evening, she found her children teaching Amara a Spanish nursery rhyme they'd learned from their grandmother, all 3 of them giggling at Amara's pronunciation. "Tomorrow?" Rosa asked hopefully, and Amara nodded, her heart swelling with something that felt dangerously close to hope. Word spread through the building like wildfire in dry grass. The pregnant woman in 4B who was facing eviction, she was good with children. She was trustworthy. She was affordable. She was desperate enough to accept whatever people could pay, but dignified enough to treat their children like precious gifts. By the end of the second day, Amara had watched 7 different children and earned $160, more money than she'd seen in months. Mothers knocked on her door at all hours, some sheepish, some desperate, all needing help. There was Jasmine, a single mother who worked at the convenience store and paid in groceries. There was Patricia, who cleaned offices at night and paid $20 but also brought dinner for Amara every time she dropped off her son. There was Keiko, who worked 2 jobs and sometimes fell asleep standing up when she came to collect her daughter, but never forgot to ask Amara how she was feeling, how the baby was doing. The apartment that had felt like a prison became a sanctuary, filled with children's drawings taped to the walls, toys made from household items, and the constant sound of life happening despite the odds. On the morning of the 3rd day, the day of eviction, Amara woke to a knock on her door. She expected Mr. Harrison with the sheriff, come to throw her few possessions onto the street. Instead, she found a group of women standing in the hallway. Mrs. Chen, Rosa, Jasmine, Patricia, Keiko, and 4 others she'd met over the past 2 days. They stood there like an army in scrubs and work uniforms, holding envelopes and small bags. "We heard," Mrs. Chen said simply, "about the eviction." Amara's cheeks burned with shame, but Rosa stepped forward, pressing an envelope into her hand. "We took a collection," she said. "It's not much, but—" Amara opened the envelope with shaking fingers. Inside was $480 in crumpled bills, obviously gathered from tips jars and savings hidden in coffee cans. "We need you," Patricia said firmly. "Our children need you. This building needs you." Tears rolled down Amara's face as she looked at these women who had so little but were willing to share it with her. They weren't just offering money. They were offering community, support, a reason to keep fighting when everything seemed lost. When Mr. Harrison arrived an hour later, expecting to find Amara packed and ready to leave, he instead found her surrounded by 9 women and 14 children. The hallway was crowded with people who had taken time off work, lost wages they couldn't afford to lose, to stand with her. Amara stepped forward, her chin raised despite the tears on her cheeks, and handed him an envelope with the $480 plus the $160 she'd earned. "This is for this month," she said, her voice steady despite the earthquake in her chest. "I'll have next month's rent on time." Mr. Harrison counted the money twice, his expression unreadable behind his thick glasses. The children watched him with wide eyes, some hiding behind their mother's legs, others boldly staring at this man who held so much power over their lives. Marcus toddled forward and offered Mr. Harrison his wooden spoon, a gesture so innocent and pure that even the landlord's stone heart seemed to crack slightly. "You're running a daycare in there," he said, not a question but a statement. Amara's heart sank. Running a business from the apartment was definitely against the lease. "These women need help," she said simply. "Their children need somewhere safe while they work to pay rent to you." The silence stretched like a rubber band about to snap. Mr. Harrison looked at the women, really looked at them for perhaps the first time. He saw the exhaustion in their faces, the determination in their eyes, the way they stood together like a wall protecting one of their own. "You'd need a license," he said finally. "The city requires permits for home daycares. Insurance, too." Amara's shoulders sagged. Licenses cost money she didn't have. Permits required applications she didn't know how to fill out. Insurance was a luxury she couldn't even dream about. "How much?" Mrs. Chen asked, stepping forward. "How much to make it legal?" Mr. Harrison named a figure that might as well have been $1 million. The women exchanged glances, silent communication flowing between them. "We'll figure it out," Rosa said firmly. "Give us a month." Mr. Harrison studied them for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "1 month," he said. "But the rent still needs to be paid on time." As he walked away, the women erupted in a mixture of tears and laughter, hugging Amara and each other, their children dancing around their legs, not understanding the magnitude of what had just happened but celebrating anyway. Over the next month, the women became Amara's university, teaching her everything they knew about survival and success. Mrs. Chen, with her medical knowledge, helped create health and safety protocols that would satisfy the city inspectors. Rosa, who had once worked in an office before the factory, helped with the paperwork, spending her few free hours filling out forms in her careful handwriting. Patricia's cousin worked at City Hall and guided them through the Byzantine permit process, cutting through red tape with insider knowledge. Jasmine's brother-in-law was a contractor who fixed the broken fan and painted the walls for free, transforming the shabby apartment into something that looked almost professional. Keiko's mother, a retired teacher, donated educational toys and books she'd collected over 40 years of teaching. They pooled their resources, had bake sales in the building's courtyard, sold anything they could spare. Every dollar was counted, every penny allocated. Amara studied for the licensing exam while children napped around her, memorizing regulations while spooning baby food into hungry mouths, learning about child development while experiencing it firsthand with the growing collection of children who came through her door. The day the license arrived in the mail, Amara was 8 months pregnant and could barely see her feet over her belly. The official document, with its raised seal and formal language, seemed surreal in her hands. She was now legally operating Little Miracles Daycare, a name chosen by the children who voted on it with the seriousness of a presidential election. The apartment could legally accommodate 8 children at a time, and she had a waiting list of 20. Word had spread beyond the building to the surrounding neighborhood, carried by mothers who whispered about the pregnant woman who never turned anyone away, who accepted payment in groceries when cash was short, who treated every child like they were her own. The walls were now covered with educational posters and children's artwork. The corner where the couch used to be had become a reading nook with pillows donated by a local church. The kitchen table, bought second-hand and painted bright yellow by the children, served as an art station in the morning and homework station in the afternoon. What had been a place of desperation had transformed into a place of hope, one finger painting at a time. When Amara went into labor on a Tuesday morning, she was in the middle of teaching 5 toddlers the alphabet song. The first contraction hit during LMNOP, but she finished the song, then calmly called Mrs. Chen, who rushed over from her shift to take over. The children barely noticed the transition, too engaged in the activities Amara had prepared in advance, knowing this day would come. 16 hours later, Amara held her daughter, Esperanza, whose name meant hope in Spanish, chosen to honor Rosa and all the women who had given her hope when she had none. The hospital room filled with visitors, women, and children who had become family through circumstance and choice. They brought homemade food that violated every hospital rule, toys for the baby that their own children had chosen to share, and promises that they would keep the daycare running while Amara recovered. Marcus toddled over to look at the baby and declared her pretty baby in his serious toddler voice, then offered her his wooden spoon, the same one he'd offered Mr. Harrison, as if bestowing a blessing. 3 weeks later, Amara returned to the daycare with Esperanza in a carrier on her chest, the baby sleeping peacefully despite the chaos of 8 children playing around them. She had worried that managing a newborn while caring for other children would be impossible, but the opposite proved true. The older children took their roles as big brothers and sisters seriously, fetching diapers, singing to Esperanza when she cried, teaching her colors and shapes she was too young to understand. The mothers who dropped off their children often lingered, offering advice, sharing their own stories, creating a network of support that extended far beyond childcare. Mr. Harrison stopped by one day, ostensibly to check on the apartment but really to see the transformation. He watched Amara teaching a group of 4-year-olds to count using beans and egg cartons, Esperanza sleeping peacefully in her carrier, and something in his expression softened. "You've made something here," he said quietly, and Amara wasn't sure if he meant the daycare or the community or both. Within 6 months, the waiting list had grown to 50 families. Amara was turning people away, something that broke her heart each time she had to do it. She remembered too well what it felt like to be desperate with nowhere to turn. That's when Mrs. Chen's husband, David, who worked in commercial real estate, mentioned an empty storefront 6 blocks away. The owner was looking for a stable tenant, someone who would improve the neighborhood. The rent was more than Amara could afford, but by now she had learned that impossible was just another word for hasn't been figured out yet. She approached the Small Business Administration with a business plan written on notebook paper, filled with earnest projections and testimonials from parents. She was rejected twice, told her plan wasn't professional enough, wasn't detailed enough. Rosa's teenage daughter, who was studying business in community college, rewrote it using proper terminology and spreadsheets that made Amara's head spin but impressed the loan officers. The day Amara signed the lease for her second location, Esperanza took her first steps, stumbling from Amara's arms to Mrs. Chen's, both women crying at the perfection of the timing. The new space was 3 times larger than the apartment, with real classrooms, a proper kitchen, and a playground in the back that needed work but had potential. The mothers who had become her extended family showed up with paintbrushes and hope, transforming the empty storefront into Little Miracles Daycare, Yukao, over a weekend that involved more laughter than should have been possible while doing manual labor. They painted murals of rainbow trees and smiling suns, assembled furniture with missing instructions and extra screws, created something beautiful from nothing but determination and love. The grand opening drew families from across the neighborhood, people who had heard about the woman who started with nothing and built something extraordinary. The local newspaper ran a story with the headline, "From Eviction to Education, Local Woman's Journey," but it couldn't capture the whole truth of it. The nights Amara had gone hungry so others could eat. The times she'd been so tired she could barely stand but stayed up anyway to comfort a crying child. The moments of doubt when only the faith of others kept her going. By Esperanza's second birthday, there were 3 Little Miracles locations. Each one was run by one of the mothers who had stood with Amara in that hallway, women who had learned the business by living it, who understood what it meant to need help and to give it. Mrs. Chen managed the original location in the apartment building, which Mr. Harrison had officially designated as commercial space at a reduced rent, his own small miracle in a story full of them. Rosa ran the second location with the same fierce protectiveness she showed for her own twins. Patricia had quit her night cleaning job to manage the third location, finally able to work during the day and see her son grow up. They employed 15 people, all mothers from the neighborhood who needed flexible schedules and understood that sometimes a sick child meant missing work, and that was okay. The business model shouldn't have worked, built on compassion rather than profit margins. But it thrived because it filled a need that went beyond childcare to community, beyond service to love. The fourth location opened in a former church, donated by a congregation that had shrunk too small to maintain the building, but wanted it used for something that mattered. Amara stood in the empty sanctuary, imagining children's voices replacing hymns, imagining toys where pews used to be, and felt her parents' presence so strongly she could almost see them. They had always told her that God worked in mysterious ways, that sometimes the worst moments in life were just preparation for something better. She hadn't believed them when they died, hadn't believed anything except that life was cruel and unfair. But, standing in that church, holding Esperanza's hand while her daughter chased dust motes in the colored light from stained glass windows, Amara understood that maybe they had been right. Maybe every terrible moment had been leading to this, to a purpose she couldn't have imagined when she was standing in that doorway holding an eviction notice. The fifth location was the most ambitious, a partnership with the city to provide subsidized daycare for families living in shelters. Amara had proposed it to the mayor at a community meeting, standing up on shaking legs, 9 months pregnant with her second child, and speaking truth about poverty and parenthood that made uncomfortable people squirm in their seats. But the mayor, a mother herself, had listened, really listened. The city would provide the building and partial funding. Amara would provide the expertise and heart. The renovation took 6 months and every penny of profit from the other locations. But when it opened with a ribbon-cutting ceremony attended by city officials and news crews, Amara knew it was worth it. This location would serve the families she had once been, the ones choosing between work and childcare, the ones counting pennies and praying for miracles. She named it Second Chances Daycare, and on the wall of the entrance, she hung a framed photo of herself from that day 5 years ago, pregnant and scared, standing in a doorway that had seemed like an ending but was actually a beginning. Now, 5 years after that eviction notice, Amara walked through the bright doors of her fifth location, her hand holding Esperanza's, her son Gabriel balanced on her hip. The woman who had once counted $17.32 to her name now signed paychecks for 43 employees. The woman who had begged for one more week now owned buildings worth millions. But more than the money, more than the success measured in numbers and newspaper articles, was the community she had built. Every morning, she was greeted by children who ran to hug her legs, by parents who trusted her with their most precious possessions, by employees who had their own stories of struggle and triumph. The walls of every location were covered with photos of children who had passed through their doors, some now in elementary school, some in middle school, all carrying with them the lessons learned in rooms filled with love and possibility. In her office at the main location, Amara kept 3 things on her desk: the original eviction notice, yellowed and creased from folding, the wooden spoon Marcus had given her that first night, smooth from years of handling, and a photo of all the women who had stood with her in that hallway, their faces fierce with determination. When prospective parents asked about her qualifications, she would touch these objects and tell them the truth. She wasn't traditionally qualified. She didn't have a degree in early childhood education when she started, though she had earned one since through night school and online classes. What she had was an understanding of what it meant to struggle, to need help, to trust strangers with your children because you had no choice. She had learned that sometimes the best business plan was just showing up, that sometimes the best curriculum was love, that sometimes the best qualification was having been broken and choosing to build something from the pieces. Every month, Amara held a free workshop for young mothers, teaching them not just child care but business basics, sharing everything she had learned about licenses and loans, about building credit and building dreams. She partnered with the community college to provide internships, giving young women the chance to learn while earning. She created a sliding scale payment system that meant no one was turned away for inability to pay full price, and somehow, miraculously, the books always balanced. The business professors who came to study her model said it shouldn't work, that compassion and capitalism were incompatible, but Amara knew better. She knew that when you lifted others, you rose yourself. When you fed the hungry, you were fed. When you gave hope to the hopeless, hope returned to you tenfold. Mr. Harrison, now in his 70s, served on the board of directors for Little Miracles, Inc., a transformation that surprised everyone who had known him as the stern landlord with a stone heart. He had become one of Amara's biggest supporters, not with money but with connections, introducing her to property owners and city officials, vouching for her when banks hesitated. At board meetings, he would often remind everyone of that day in the hallway, of the women who had stood together, of the courage it had taken for Amara to hand him that envelope. "I've been a businessman for 50 years, he would say, "but that young woman taught me what business really means. It's not about profit. It's about people. It's about purpose." He had even started a scholarship fund for children of single mothers, named after his own mother who had raised him alone after his father died in the war. The story could have ended there, with success and accolades, with Amara as the inspirational figure who had overcome impossible odds. But life doesn't end with achievement. It continues with new challenges and new opportunities. When the pandemic hit, Amara had to close 4 of her 5 locations temporarily, keeping only the original apartment running for essential workers' children. She spent sleepless nights figuring out how to pay employees who desperately needed income, how to serve families who still needed care, how to keep hope alive when the world seemed to be ending. She converted her locations into food distribution centers, using the commercial kitchens to prepare meals for families in need. She organized virtual story times for children stuck at home, her employees reading books over video calls to maintain connection. She negotiated with landlords, pleaded with banks, and somehow, through determination and community support, kept all 5 locations from closing permanently. When the locations reopened, the families came back, some having lost jobs, some having lost loved ones, all having lost the illusion that life was predictable or safe. Amara met them with the same spirit she had shown that first night with Marcus, the understanding that sometimes survival meant simply showing up for each other. She expanded mental health services, bringing in counselors to help children process trauma. She created support groups for parents, circles of healing where tears were welcome and judgment was forbidden. The daycare centers became more than places to leave children. They became sanctuaries of hope in a world that had shown its fragility. The walls filled with new artwork, pictures of rainbows and hearts, messages of love and resilience drawn by small hands that had already learned too much about loss. On the 5th anniversary of opening her 5th location, Amara stood before a crowd at the annual Little Miracles Gala, an event that raised funds for families who couldn't afford childcare. The ballroom was filled with people whose lives had been touched by her story, parents who had found not just childcare but community, employees who had found not just jobs but purpose, children who had grown up in her centers and were now in high school or college, returning to volunteer and give back. Esperanza, now 7, stood beside her mother, wearing a dress she had picked out herself, her face serious with the importance of the moment. Gabriel, 5, fidgeted with his bow tie but stood still when Amara placed her hand on his shoulder. The speech Amara had prepared lay forgotten on the podium as she looked out at the faces before her, each one a chapter in a story that had begun with an eviction notice. 5 years ago, Amara began, her voice steady but full of emotion. I stood in a doorway with an eviction notice, 6 months pregnant, with $17.32 to my name. I thought it was the end of everything. I thought I had failed before my child was even born. But that eviction notice, that moment of absolute desperation became the foundation for something I never could have imagined. She was broke and pregnant. Now she owns 5 daycares. That's what the newspapers say. That's the headline that makes people click and share and feel inspired. But that's not the real story. The real story is about Mrs. Chen, who gave me a chance when she had every reason not to trust a desperate stranger. It's about Rosa, who paid me extra when she could barely afford the regular rate. It's about every woman who stood in that hallway and refused to let me fall. It's about every child who walked through our doors and taught me that love is not a limited resource, that the more you give, the more you have. She paused, looking down at her children, then back at the crowd. I didn't build this empire alone. We built it together. One wooden spoon, one sleepless night, one act of kindness at a time. We built it on the radical idea that every mother deserves support, every child deserves quality care, and every family deserves to thrive, not just survive. We built it on the belief that rock bottom is not a grave but a foundation, that poverty is not a character flaw but a circumstance, that success is not measured in dollars but in the lives you touch and the hope you spread. This empire isn't made of buildings and bank accounts. It's made of the tears we've dried, the meals we've shared, the children we've raised together. It's made of second chances and third chances, and as many chances as it takes to get it right. The room was silent except for the soft sound of crying, tears of recognition, of remembrance, of gratitude. Amara continued, her own tears flowing freely now. To every mother out there facing eviction, counting pennies, wondering how you'll feed your children tomorrow, I want you to know that your story isn't over. Your circumstances don't define your destiny. Your current struggle is not your final chapter. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the best thing that ever happened. Not because suffering is noble, but because it teaches you that you're stronger than you knew. That community is more powerful than currency. That hope is a choice you make every morning when you get up and try again. To every person who has ever felt broken beyond repair, I want you to know that broken things can be beautiful. They can be the beginning of something extraordinary. They can be the cracks where the light gets in. As Amara finished speaking, the room erupted in applause, but she barely heard it. She was looking at Esperanza, who was looking back at her with eyes that held understanding beyond her years. This child who had been born into struggle but raised in strength, who had spent her first years surrounded by children of every color and circumstance, who understood that family was not just about blood, but about bonds forged in hardship and hope. She was looking at Gabriel, who had never known poverty but would grow up understanding privilege as responsibility, not entitlement. She was looking at the women who had become her sisters, the children who had become her extended family, the community that had become her world. 5 daycares, 43 employees, hundreds of families served, thousands of lives touched, all from a desperate moment in a doorway, a wooden spoon offered in friendship, and the courage to believe that tomorrow could be different from today. The gala raised enough money to fund free child care for 50 families for a year, but more than money was raised that night. Stories were shared of other women who had started businesses from desperation, other communities that had come together to support their most vulnerable members, other miracles that had grown from the soil of adversity. The ripple effects of Amara's story spread outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water, touching shores she would never see. A young woman in another city, facing her own eviction, read about Amara and found the courage to ask for help. A landlord in another state, remembering Mr. Harrison's transformation, gave a struggling tenant another chance. A group of mothers in another neighborhood, inspired by the hallway army, organized their own childcare cooperative. The story became larger than one woman, one building, one moment of crisis. It became a testament to the power of community, the strength of mothers, the possibility that exists in the darkest moments if we're brave enough to reach for it. Years later, when business students would study the Little Miracles model in their classes, when economists would puzzle over how it succeeded despite violating conventional wisdom, when journalists would write follow-up stories on the 10th and 15th anniversaries, they would all miss the essential truth that Amara knew in her bones. Success wasn't about the business model or the marketing strategy or the financial projections. Success was about seeing the humanity in everyone, about believing that everyone deserved dignity and support, about understanding that we rise by lifting others. It was about transforming spaces of desperation into places of hope, about turning survival into purpose, about recognizing that sometimes the greatest miracles come disguised as disasters. The empire she had built wasn't measured in square footage or revenue streams, but in the lives that had been changed, the families that had been preserved, the children who grew up believing that anything was possible because they had seen it happen. In the apartment where it all began, now renovated but still bearing the traces of its history, a new mother stood with an eviction notice in her hand. She had heard about this place, about the woman who had started here with nothing and built something extraordinary. She knocked on the door of what was now the original Little Miracles location, her baby in her arms, her heart in her throat. Amara herself answered, as she still did sometimes, wanting to stay connected to the roots of what they had built. She saw herself in this young woman's eyes, the desperation, the fear, the tiny flame of hope that refused to be extinguished. Without hesitation, Amar took the baby so the mother could cry freely, then led her inside where other mothers were waiting, where children were playing, where hope lived in every corner. "Tell me your story," Amara said gently, and as the young woman began to speak, another chapter began in the endless story of women helping women, of community conquering crisis, of miracles that start with nothing more than the courage to knock on a door and ask for help. The cycle continued, would always continue, because that's how empires of compassion are built. Not in boardrooms or banks, but in moments of human connection, in the decision to see another's struggle as your own, in the faith that together we can build something from nothing. She was broke and pregnant. Now she owns 5 daycares, but that was never the whole story. The whole story was about all of them. Every mother who had struggled, every child who had been cared for, every person who had chosen to help rather than look away. It was about the transformation of spaces and spirits, the alchemy that turns desperation into determination, the magic that happens when women stand together and refuse to let each other fall. The empire would continue to grow, not because of business plans or marketing strategies, but because the need was real. The solution was love, and the foundation was unshakable. The belief that every person deserves a chance, every child deserves care, and every story of struggle can become a story of triumph if we're brave enough to begin.